Hi, it's Dr. Ray. I'm here to walk you through the elements of short stories. So let's jump right in. Key terms we're going to review, a lot of these are probably familiar to you. And I also think it's helpful to think of how it also helps us reflect on film, because so many of the things that we're reading in literature are also things that, like, the director, the writer, even the actors are trying to convey to us through film. So I've used that as an analogy to help us kind of dig into these terms. There's setting, characters, theme, plot, and historical context, which is often also called cultural context. Setting. Okay, so we know the setting is the time and place where the action occurs. I know you're probably very familiar with that if anyone's ever been part of a stage production in elementary school, high school, even beyond. What they put on stage is meant to convey to the readers, hey, this is the setting, this is where the action is taking place. And you're probably familiar with things like a backdrop or furniture. But when you're in literature, the setting, and again, film too, also can include the scenery. What customs are the people taking part in around the character where the action's happening? What transportation is present? Like, that's certainly going to affect our reading if it's someone in a carriage or in a time machine. What time of year is it? The clothing the characters are wearing, it could both convey historical time period, their class, how they see themselves. Dialects, language, especially if it's not the main character or supporting character themselves, that helps to create the setting around them. The weather is often very significant. A lot is conveyed through like rain and darkness and these kind of things. The time of day, right? Something happening between 4 a.m. versus happening at 2 p.m. It's a very different setting and has a very different kind of energy for the characters involved. What are the functions of a setting? It creates a mood or an atmosphere. It shows the reader a different way of life, especially for a reading story of an hour. None of us were alive in 1894 in a marriage trying to navigate a home, which is where we spent, where as a wife, at least, you would have spent the majority of your time. So the setting's very important there. It makes the action more real. I'm a dork and I'm learning how to write fiction. I've always been a professor and a literary critic, but I've joined a writing group. And while some of my colleagues in the writing group write beautiful fiction, I've noticed there's just really no setting where this action is taking place. And I keep telling them I need to see it, right? It doesn't feel real when it's just happening in a void. You need the setting to kind of cement what's happening in the scene. Often the setting itself is a source of conflict or struggle. And of course, it can be symbolic. So if you look at the images here, I know the movie's been out for 15 years. That makes me feel very old. The Hunger Games, though, when Katniss is, navigating the arenas that they're having that they're battling each other, I guess is the best explanation. If you look at that top image, the setting is hostile, right? Like, it's swampy. She can't see what's coming at her. It's part of the conflict that she's dealing with. The setting's very important. The bottom one is from Harry Potter, whether you've read the books or seen the movie, or even I'm sure you've at least seen a trailer or something or seen it at Disney World. The setting of Hogwarts is supposed to create, an emotion in the reader, the viewer, right? It looks otherworldly and important and, ethereal, and all these important things that are conveyed through that setting. So again, setting, something to think about when you're reading. Symbolism. I know a symbol is a term you're familiar with, but it can take lots of different forms. Generally, it's an object representing another idea, another meaning. For example, I love Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. The Ring of Power represents many different ideas, especially, evil and corruption, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like, all these ideas, when you look at it, it's just a hunk of metal with elvish writing on it, just like my wedding ring. When you think about it, it's just a metal circle. It's the idea that's behind it that is significant. The dove with the olive branch, again, I mean, if you want to be direct, it's a bird with a stick, but it conveys the idea of peace and all that means. A red rose, right? Typically romance, love, passion. And even I included the infinity symbol because, again, it's just a shape, but to us, it can mean something eternal. And I have the bat symbol because why not? I love superhero stuff. But again, it's just the shape. It doesn't even really look that much like a bat, but it means something to us, and it's supposed to strike terror right in the hearts of his enemies. So symbolism is very important. And sometimes symbols aren't so obvious in a story as they might be in a movie or something. And you can find symbolism in things that other people might not. We'll dig into it in a moment, but like in Story of an Hour, I've always found the armchair to be very symbolic. And one of my colleagues is like, it's just a chair, Susan, get over it. But that's the beauty of writing about literature. If you can defend your position, it's totally valid to discuss. Moving on to characters. Again, you can see that I really love my pop culture. We've got Luke Skywalker on the top right and Groot beneath him, and of course, Wednesday Addams from the newest incarnation of the Addams family by Tim Burton. Characters can be people or animals. If you know, obviously, if you've seen Guardians of the Galaxy, Rocket's a character, and he's technically a raccoon. If you've seen the Beauty and the Beast animated movie from 20, 30 years ago, furniture can be characters. Basically, anything that's animated and communicates can be a character. You need to think there's major and minor characters. So if you've ever sat through the Academy Awards, they usually have the leading role gets an Academy Award, and then the supporting role is a different thing, right? It's think about screen time and emphasis and focus tends to be on the main character, where minor characters not so much, right? Round characters and flat characters. These are terms I would love for you to include in your posts, in your writing, in our discussions. Flat characters tend to stay the same throughout a story, while round characters experience development. So if you've seen the original Star Wars, it's fine if you haven't. And again, original, I mean, the first one came out before I was born. But Luke Skywalker starts off as this kind of nerdy, uncertain, I'm going to the space station to get power converters, Uncle Ben. Like just gangly kid who doesn't quite know who he is or what he stands for. And by the third part of the series, again, the original trilogy, he's got a darker side. He's a warrior. Like he's evolved. And it's also called, you don't need this term, a Bildungsroman, is where the character tends to evolve over, during their young adulthood into the adult they're going to be. So you can see that in like Harry Potter and series like that. Wednesday Addams, if you've seen the recent series on Netflix, I would argue she develops. But typically, if you were just watching the original Addams Family, when is it, from the 60s, she's a flat character, right? She's obsessed with the spooky. She doesn't really change. She doesn't evolve. I would argue Groot is a flat character. And to be fair, I haven't seen the third movie, but I am Groot. He's Groot. He's good. He says 3 words. He doesn't really change and evolve. Characterization. So again, it's not film, it's literature we're reading. How does a writer create a character? Because I'm sure you've all read a book, even like a kid's book, where you're like, oh, that character, I identify with them. They get me. That means something. There's 2 ways. One is direct characterization, where they just tell you about the character, or if the character is speaking in first person, I am this, I am like that. It's just kind of a list of who they are and what they believe in. That's a direct characterization, telling you what they look like, telling you what they're doing. The other approach is indirect characterization. So I don't tell you this character is a mean person. I show them talking to other characters, and they're manipulative or they're selfish. And you get the sense that indirect characterization, oh, this is a mean character. So the writer shows what a character is like by describing what they like, by telling what the character says or does, and by including what other characters do in response to that character. So you're getting a sense of who they are just by what they're drawn toward, what they do, what they value. So if you're analyzing a character, so if I said, write me a paragraph about Mrs. Mallard in the Story of an Hour, things that you can think about. Physical appearance of a character, right? Are they a glutton? Are they, starving? Are they strong? Are they young? Are they old? Like this is a huge aspect into who they are and what we understand about them. Their personality, again, typically done indirectly by seeing how they interact with others, what they value, what their motivations are. Motivation, I know this is often brought up in film when an actor's like, what's my motivation? But why are they moving through the world? What are they trying to achieve? Why are they doing what they're doing? Their relationships and how they value those relationships and how they treat them. Conflict. How do they react in times of conflict? What conflict are they facing? And does the character evolve? Do they change? Are they flat or round? And again, because media and pop culture tends to be kind of, a shared thing. I've got Moana. My kids loved that movie. They've grown out of it a little bit, but definitely I think she evolves to someone who's got more agency and independence. There's definitely that Bildungsroman going on. Sherlock Holmes, if you've ever read a Sherlock Holmes story, Typically, he is him throughout. He's kind of callous, he's brilliant, he wants to solve, he doesn't really care that much about those around him, and he's focused, right? There's not a whole lot of development. And then I've got some other examples, like I love Miss Teagues in Abbott Elementary, and then we've got Rick from Walking Dead, and of course, Black Panther. Conflict. There's no story without conflict. So sometimes I'll have the TV on, maybe it's a sitcom, and one of my kids, I have 2 10-year-old boys, will be like, "Oh, why is this happening to the character?" And I'm like, "Well, honey, if there's no problem, there's no story. They're just people in a room. There has to be a conflict. It's what drives the work, right?" So clearly conflict is a struggle between 2 forces. Every plot has some kind of conflict. Conflict, there can be more than one, of course. So if you're reading a novel like, I don't know, like Lord of the Rings, yes, there's the major conflict of trying to, get the ring and defeat Sauron, but there's minor conflicts in between the characters, like dealing with their own emotions. And with that in mind, conflicts can be internal or external. So again, going back to Lord of the Rings, it's fine if you haven't watched or read it, but there's a character named Frodo that, yes, he's facing this huge end of the world conflict, but there's also an internal conflict going on, an internal struggle to hold on to the goodness and what the motive, what he set out to do. So again, external conflict, outside world, other people. Internal conflict takes place internally in one's mind. A theme. It can also be called an abstract concept, an abstract idea. It's a message or an idea that runs throughout a work. And again, this can be, we're talking about literature, story, a book, poem. Also, you'll see this like, in film. Occasionally, it'll be stated, that like you'll like that there's making a commentary about marriage or something. Typically it's implied. So we pick up as we're reading a story of an hour, oh, okay, themes in this story that the author is considering are marriage and independence and love and autonomy and expectations, like just ideas. So some ideas that you might, recognize from just literature, film, whatnot. Injustice, the hero's journey, violence could be a theme. The American dream could be a theme. That's something we're going to look at moving forward. Love, sacrifice. So when I find a theme in a story, it might be different than one you find. Like there's so many to dig out. But again, it's an idea that runs through that entire work. How is a plot set up? So almost every story, novel, novella, drama, play, it follows this pattern of plot. You've got the exposition, right, which is the beginning of the story where characters and the setting are introduced. You got to start somewhere. The rising action, right? Something has to happen. You can't just stay in that room looking at the character. Really look, something has to occur. So where the main character faces a series of conflict or an incident, the climax of the story, right? The most exciting part of the story, that that the thing that, just think of it as the moment that changes everything afterwards, right? The pinnacle. And then you get to the falling action, what happens ever afterwards, like the events that are leading us towards the end of the story. And then the resolution, also called the denouement. I can't speak French. For those of you who do, I apologize for my butchering of the word, but there's the resolution, the end of the story. So just keep that in mind as you're reading, and you can kind of follow along where those moments are occurring and how the author put it together, because that's really what writing about literature is. It's digging out the importance in a work and figuring out what the author's intentions were in constructing it. Last slide. I mentioned before cultural/historical context. So again, this isn't as relevant if you're reading something like fantasy, again, Lord of the Rings. You might dig into the historical context of the world J.R.R. Tolkien was living in and how that's reflected in the story. But again, that's an entire fantastical realm. When it's realist literature, which is most of what we're reading this semester, meaning it sounds like something that could have happened and is grounded in a reality the readers know, you need to think about that cultural historical context. So the moods, attitudes, conditions that existed in a certain period of time. Context is like this is the setting for an event that occurs, and it will have an impact on the relevance of the event. So again, story of an hour. I've got a picture of my outgoing suffragette here. It takes place before women have the right to vote, own property, serve on a jury. All these things you have to understand that in order to appreciate the character's perspective in that story. So I'll stop there. I hope you'll keep these terms and ideas in mind as you think about the literature we're looking at this semester.